The Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Tzadi Zayin Amid Beis had established that if a person is mafresh in the keva, the Torah requires a zachar for Korban Pesach. Or, for example, he was mafresh a lamb that was already past its first year into its second year, that in those cases, the Korban Pesach is possible. And we have a principle called yira, which means until it becomes a balmum, and then after it becomes a balmum, then we sell its value on the market, and we take the monies and we dedicate it towards buying a korban. And then the Mishnah goes on to speak about how mafresh pischo v'mes lo yivienu b'no achrov l'shem pesach el l'shem shlomim. On that part of the Mishnah, we'll have a whole sugya later on. Omer Rav Huna. So we're now on Daf Tzadiches Omer Aleph, the beginning of the Gemara on the second line. Grade Rav Yeshua Shmami no tlas. From our Mishnah, in the case where he was mafresh in a keva or a zachar ben shtei shanim, and the principle is yirah ad sheyistayev, and then we sell it on the market, and the monies go for a korban nedava, and nadav shlamim. Shma mino tlas. Let's derive three different halachic principles from our Mishnah. Number one, shma mino bali chayim nidachim. That there's a principle called dichui, which means that once an animal is nidches from korban, it would never be able to be used as a korban, even if after time period, the original reason why it was disqualified is no longer extant. Nevertheless, we can never be makriv such a korban, and this applies even to a live korban. Shmamina dichui meikara, havi dichui. And we have another conclusion here from our Mishnah, that even though this behemoth, from the moment that you designated it as a korban, it was already dachui, there was never a moment that it was roy and then it became dachui. Nevertheless, there is such a thing as dachui meikara. And from the get-go, when he was mafresh in the cave of Zachar ben Shnatayim, this behemoth was excluded, was disqualified from the Mizbeach from the beginning of its Kedusha. And it could never be brought as a korban. Ushmamin on the third nafkamina that we're going to derive from our Mishnah is yesh dichui b'damin. What that means is that when a person designates a korban and he's magdish it, or a korban, which means kedusha saguf, but in this case it cannot be a korban because he wants to be mafresh something that's completely disqualified. In that case, the hegnesh that's chal is a kedushas damin, which means that its value on the market is being designated as a korban. So we would have thought that perhaps in such a case, we shouldn't completely reject this korban from being brought on the Mizbeach, because if later on the reason for its disqualification is removed, then it should jump back into the arena. It should be able to be brought as a korban shlamim. And the classic case of dichui b'damim is a case where you have two shutfim, two partners, joint ownership on an animal, and one of them was makdish his half in the animal. The other one was not. And then the one who was makdish it buys out the other half from the other partner, and now he's makdish the second half. And in the Gemara in Tzvachim Daf Yud Beis, Rabbi Yochanan says that the behema is kedosha v'eina kreva. It means it's kedusha when he was magdish only his half is a kedusha's damim, and it cannot be brought on the mizbeach. But now he bought the other half and he was magdish the other half. No, it's dachui. You can never bring it on the mizbeach, even when he buys the other half and he's magdish. So too here, in our case where he was magdish a korban, which is completely inappropriate, unsuitable for Pesach, and its kedusha now should be a kedushas damim. Nevertheless, we're going to still apply the law of dichui even to kedushas damim, and even if afterwards he would want to designate this carbon, for example, as a carbon shlomim, and that's the din of Mosar Pesach, he cannot do so because there was a dichui that was chal on this behemoth. Now, the Mishnah says that if he designates a Pesach and he dies, this was the sefer of the Mishnah that we wanted to study, then his son could not bring it as a carbon Pesach, he could only bring it as a shlomim. And now the Gemara quotes a brisa to explain this Mishnah. And we'll see exactly when he died, but at this point, in a generic sense, he died, and Beno Memuna Imo, but his son was also included in the original Minui, is then Yevienu, let the son bring the Karma, L'Shum Pesach, and there's no problem. Ein Beno Memuna Imo, but if his son was not money on this carbon Pesach, now when the father dies, this is a Pesach that has no Bailim. And a Pesach without Bailim is Yevienu L'Shum Shlomim. It can never be brought as a carbon Pesach, but it can be brought as a carbon shlom. But when are they makriv the carbon? L'shishasa, only on the 16th of Nisan. And it has the din of Mosar Pesach, and it's brought at shlom. So the Gemara says l'shishasar in l'chamishasar lo. We cannot be makriv this shlomim on Pesach itself. And the reason is because our Tana reflects the opinion that Nidarim and Nidavas ain't craving beyontif. The status of this carbon shlomim is that of an idava, and we don't bring an idava on yontif. So therefore, we have to wait until the 16th after the day of yontif passes. Now the Gemara analyzes this case where the father died. The Misa of Amos, when did he die? Did he die before Chatzos on Erev Pesach or after Chatzos? If you're going to tell me, the Mis Kodem Chatzos, Chatzos, of course, is the Tchilas Man Shchitas HaPesach, and if he died before that, why is it that Beno Memuna Imo Yevienu L'Shum Pesach, that if his son is also included in the minui, he can bring it as Pesach? The moment that his father dies, the son has the status of an onen. And that was chal already before the Zman of Shechita, because his father died before Chatzos. And we learned the Gemara back on Daf Tzadi that we don't shech the Korban Pesach on behalf of an onen if he's the only one who's money on the carbon, because we're afraid that he might come in contact with the dead, in this case with his father, and then he cannot eat from the Korban Pesach, and the Korban Pesach will therefore become nosar. So if the son was an onen at the time of the chiyuv shchitas HaPesach, then we won't bring such a Korban Pesach. And the Mishnah says that if the son is manu, he will bring the Korban Pesach. But that doesn't make any sense because he's an onen. His father died before Shchitas HaPesach, and we're always going to be afraid that he might come to be Mitame himself. And once he's Mitame, he can't eat the Korban Pesach, and the Pesach will become Nosar. If this be the case, then the son as an onen was not chayiv in Korban Pesach at the time of Chatzos, when it's the moment of Shchitas HaPesach, and yet the Mishnah says Yevienu, which sounds like that he, the son, will bring the carbon. How can he bring the carbon if he's an onen? Ella, by process of elimination, we have to assume to miss when did the father die? Li achar Chatzos. So the ben was money on this Pesach, and at the time of the chiyuv of Havas HaPesach, he was not an onen because his father died later. So in such a case, the son will bring the Korban Pesach, and we're not afraid that he'll come to be Mitami Lemes, because he's already in the mode, even before his father's died, of a Chiyuv Pesach, intending to eat the Pesach. He'll be very careful not to be metamius. But now we have a problem. Why? Because the Mishnah says, the Brisa says, Ein beno memuna imo yavi enu l'shum shlomim. If the son is not in the minui, then the carbon is brought as a shlomim. The Gemara says, I don't understand. Hakavate chatzos. At the moment of chatzos, when the chiyuv carbon Pesach was chal, this Pesach was hukba, was designated and sanctified as a carbon Pesach. But now it's Mesu Balov. After Chatzos, after it was Hukbal Pesach, the father died, and that means it's Mesu Bailov. There's no Bailim on the carbon. In such a case, since there was already a kvius on the carbon as a Pesach, then when the father dies and it's Mesu Balov, we have a din of Dichui. And the carbon Pesach is Nidche Legamre. It cannot be brought as a carbon Shlomim. It's already subject to the law of Dichui. So the Gemara now is going to offer, I think it's all told, 5 different answers to explain this Mishnah. I think it's 5. Omar Rav. Here's number 1. Li olam demis kodem chatzos. Father died before chatzos. And in such a case, if the son is not monui, the carbon cannot be brought as a Pesach, obviously, because there's no Bailim. But the carbon was never Nikbal Pesach. Why? Because at Chatzos, which is the moment to be Kover the carbon as a Pesach, the Bailim would garner it. And there's no meaning on the part of the son. So it's Mesav Bailu. Mesav Bailu is a royal Pesach. It was never Nikbal Pesach, and therefore there's no din of Dichli. And therefore, the son can bring the carbon as a shlomim on the 16th of Nisan. Because by the time we get to the 16th of Nisan, he's no longer an Oneh. Umay, and what does the Tana mean in the ratio when it says that if the son is moni imo yevi enu l'shum Pesach? And we ask the following question, that if the father died before Chatzos, then the son was already an onen, and in such a case, he's not going to be included in the Chiyuv Pesach. So the answer is Yevienu l'shum Pesach Sheni. When the Brisa says that in such a case where the son is Manu, he will bring it as a Pesach, the intention is not that he brings it as a Pesach Rishon, that he can't do because he's an onen, but rather he is pushed off to Pesach Sheni. So again, we cannot interpret the Mishnah, says Rava Kipshuta, that the son will, since he's money, will bring the carbon Pesach Rishon because he's already an Onen. But what the Mishnah had in mind is that he should bring it as a Pesach Sheni. Abai says, no, we're talking about Pesach Rishon. We have no interest here in introducing into this Brisa Pesach Sheni. Litstadim Ktani. But the 2 cases in the Brisa are referring to 2 different scenarios. In the Reisha, father died after Chatzos, and in the Sefer, the father died before Chatzos. And here's how Abai is going to interpret this Brisa. Meis Achar Chatzos, this is the Reisha, where the father died after Chatzos. Ubno Mimuna Imo Vivianu L'Shum Pesach. This carbon is kosher. Why? Because at the time of the Chiyuv Karban, the Chiyuv Shchita, the son was not an Onen. His father died subsequently. And not only that, but he himself, the Ben, was Memuna together with his father on the Pesach. So it means you have 2 people that are Memunim ala Pesach. One of them died. So the other one will bring the carbon. You'll say he's an Onen. The answer is that since there was a Chiyuv Karban Pesach before he became an Onen, then we assume that he'll be very careful not to be Matami L'Mesim and not to create a situation of no son. However, now we get to the Sefer, the Brisa according to Abaye, Meis Kodem Chatzos, and ein beno memuna imo. So we have now a situation where, on the one hand, the father died before chatzos, which means that that the status of onen on the ben was chal even before the chiyuv karban. So that means that there was no bilim on this karban, and therefore couldn't be nikba. There would be no kvirus to be koveat chatzos as a karban pesach, as imienu l'shum shlamim. Of Sharvi Omar, he has another interpretation of the Brisa. Olam demis liachar pesach. Both dinim in the Brisa are referring to a case where the father died after chatzos. Demis liachar chatzos, which means that the son became an onen after chatzos. Ukegon shahaya aviv goses bechatzos. The father was about to die. He was what's called a goses. We have a principle in the Gemara Kedushin, Rov goses in Lemisa. And because of Rov goses in Lemisa, that we assume he's going to die, he's not Roy Lavas HaPesach. He's considered like a mess as a goses, and he's parted from all mitzvahs, and he's parted from the Karban Pesach. Now, if the son is Manui Imo, which would mean that since the father died after Chatzos, so at Chatzos, when we cover the Pesach, the Karban L'Shem Pesach, because the Ben was Moni Olav, so the Ben could bring this Karban Pesach on his own behalf, even though he's an Onen, because since the Chiyuv Pesach, before he became an Onen, he's allowed to be Makrivit even on his own, even though he's the only Monu. But if he wasn't Monui, then since at Chatzos, his father was gone, and he's not Monui, so at Chatzos, there was no Kvius of a Karban Pesach, because there's no Bailam at all, and therefore there's no Din of Dechia, and it's brought by the Ben L'Shem Shlomim. Rav Sheshes Omar, Li'olam demis liachar Chatzos. The father died after Chatzos. He was not a goses at Chatzos, as Rav Sharvi had said. And nevertheless, the Karban Pesach is not nidcha mi'akrova. And why is that so? I mean, you would say that since at Chatzos, the father was still alive, he's not a goses, and now he dies after Chatzos, there should be a din of dichui because Chatzos was koveya the karma. Says Rav Ashi, uke Rabbi Shimon he. This brisa should be attributed to Rabbi Shimon. The Omar, and Rabbi Shimon sheet appears in Masechet Yoma Daf Samach Gimel. Ein bali chayim nidochim. That an animal which is excluded, is disqualified during its lifetime from akrava, that's not really dachui. That's not a dachui legamre. It still can be fit for a karma if the reason why it was disqualified would be removed. So therefore, if the son is not manui, so then even though the Pesach was nikbat chatzos, and at the moment that the father dies, since the son is not manui, there should be a din of dechia. But the answer is Reb Shimon holds that there's no din of dechia on an animal that's alive. And therefore, since there's no din of dechia, it's royally karev shlamim, and the son will bring it as a karban shlamim. If the son, on the other hand, is mono imo Pesach, so the Pesach still has a bailet, and it was never nidcha at all. There was no dichui, so the son could bring it as a karban Pesach. And again, the aninus is not ma'akim because, again, as we said over and over again, if there was a chalos chiyuv of Pesach at chatzos before he was an onen, then he's allowed to bring the karban Pesach. Ravina Omar could interpret this brisa even according to the Mandi Omer, who says that Bali Chaim shenifslu ma'akrava nidchim may kravli, they will never be able to be brought. But the brisa is talking about a case of kigon shefrisho achar chatzos. The whole afrasha of the karban was done after Chatzos. Umesu ba'olam acher Chatzos, and even though the owner of the carbon died after Chatzos, if the ben is manui, he could be makriv l'shem Pesach, because the chiyuv was chal at Chatzos, he was manui before he became an onen. The Katzavar, and this Tan of the Brisa holds Chatzos kava, that Chatzos itself is koveh the carbon as a carbon Pesach, and it's not that we wait for the Zman of Shechita. So since he was mafresh it after Chatzos, there was never a kvias of carbon Pesach at Chatzos, because he wasn't mafresh, he didn't designate it, was chulin. And therefore, if he doesn't bring the carbon, it's not dochli. So even though the ben is not money and mesu bailim, there's no din of dichu. It can be brought as a carbon shlamim because the afrasha was after chatzos. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Tzadiches. At the bottom of the Om. And now we're going to get into a sugya called Taroves Zvachim. HaPesach shenis ariv b'Zvachim. Rashi interprets it thusly, that he had a carbon Pesach and it got mixed up with two other lambs, the three lambs. One is a Pesach, the other is an Ola, and the third is an Asham. Now these karbanos are not the same. They don't have the uniform Zman for Achila. They have different laws of hakrava for each carbon. The Ola, for example, needs smicha, nesachim, matadamim, shtaim shein arba. It cannot be eaten. It's kula kol. The Asham needs smicha, but it doesn't require nesachim. It's matadamim, shtaim shein arba, but it's nechal kohanim. The Pesach doesn't have any requirement to smicha, nesachim, and it's matadamim is b'shvicha al kira mizbeach. I mean, basically, there's very little in common in terms of the dinim and akrava of these three karbonos. What do? Is kulam yiru achi stavu. So we wait for a mum to fall on each one of these karbonos, the machru, and then we sell them. And now we have to replace them with the monies and buy a carbon to replace all three. Yavi b'dmei hayofish behemi minzeh, b'dmei hayofish behemi minzeh. In other words, each one of these three karbonos will be evaluated based on the highest value of the three. So let's say, for example, the highest value of the three behemos is a sela. What's going to happen now is he's going to sell all three behemos at a sela. And he's going to have to be makriv, he's going to have to replace these three, each one with a sela. And now he's losing money from pocket. And there's going to be an increment of money which he loses because only one of the three animals is worth a sela. Yet he's going to have to bring three sloim. He's going to have to come up with money from his bank account in order to purchase three karbonos with three sloim. And each seller will be designated for whether it's be an asham or whether it be an ola, whether it be a pesach. It's ari b'choros, but carbon pesach gets mixed up with b'choros. Now this is a more complicated halacha because b'choros cannot be sold, and a b'chor, let's just review it, is a male tamim, a perfect without blemish that was born to a behemoth tahora, and it has kedusha. It's brought as a gift to the kohanim, and the kohanim have to bring it on the mizbeach as kodshim kalim, and they'll eat the basa. Now, if it's a bachar balmum, we give it to the kohen, but it's chulin, and the kohen can eat it anywhere he wants. He can give it away, he can sell it to anybody he wants. Now, the advantage of a bachar, as opposed to the previous case of Ola and Asham, is that a bachar is very, very similar to a carbon pesach. And it has the same derek hakrava. The only difference is going to be in terms of the time that it's allowed to be eaten. But other than that, it's pretty much identical. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Im chaburas kohanim yeachlu, yochelu, that if this chabura that joined together as a minui on the Korban Pesach was made up of exclusively kohanim, no Yisraelim, then we'll be makriv all these karbanos. The Pesach, wherever it is, we don't know which it is, will be nikrav l'shem Pesach, and the Bechoros will be yikarv l'shem bechor. So the shochet or the zorek will say at the time of the akrova of each one of these behemos, if it's a Korban Pesach, then I'm bringing it now as a Korban Pesach. If it's a bechor, then I'm bringing it as a bechor. And not only that, yochelu. This chabur of kohanim can eat all the behemos that got mixed up, but only until chatzos. So the Gemara immediately asks the following question: in this case of bechoros, how could Reb Shimon say that if the chabur is all kohanim, then they can eat the basar? They're going to have to eat the basar of all these behemoths no later than the night of Pesach. And any meat that's left over in the daytime has to be burnt. So what you're doing is you're taking a bechar, we don't know which one is the bechar, but the bechar has a din of shnei yomi v'layla echad, and you're cutting down its achila, completely disqualifying the day of the 15th because of the suffix. Maybe it's a Korban Pesach. So since you're afraid you're afraid of the possibility that this might be a Korban Pesach brought to any one of these animals, then when Boker comes around on the morning of the 15th, you have to burn the meat in Nosar. So he's being maybe the Bechar Lidei Psul Nosar, and that's Shalom Kedin because the Bechar itself gets another day. We should have said Yiroa Achi Yipol Ba'amum, and then you could eat both of them. You could eat one of them as a Bechar, because the Bechar Balmum is eaten. And with Tmei Pesach, you should bring another Behema for the same Pesach. More answers, Rabbi Shimon L'tamei, this Rabbi Shimon who is consistent with it, Shita Diomar, Meviim Kodshin L'beis Apsul. When I have a choice situation, I can either be B'mait this man, but be Machsha the Korban, or I could throw the Korban out and passel it, then I choose in favor of bringing the Korban, even if it means that we're going to have to cut down the Zman Achila. That's better than the alternative, which means that the Korban is possible. This time we learned in the Mishnah Tzvachim, Ayin A. If a Korban Asham Nisarev Bishlomim, right, there's an entire chapter in Masechet Pesachim dedicated to the laws of Korbanos that got mixed up together. So here's a case of an Asham that got mixed up with a Korban Shlomim. Now the Shlomim could be eaten for 2 days and 1 night. The Asham could only be eaten for the day and the night that follows. And Rav Shimon nevertheless says, Omer Yishachtu b'tzafon, right? Because on the side that maybe this korban that you're taking, each one might be the asham, so we have to do the shlita of an asham as kachim in the tzafon. V'e'achlu kechomer shebahem, and they will be eaten like the most chomer of all of them. Kechomer shebahem means like the din of the chomer shebahem, which is, in this case, the asham, which could only be eaten yom v'layla, could only be eaten l'zichrei kahuna, and it could only be eaten within the azara, not like shlomim, which could be eaten shnei yomim v'layla l'chol ad. So this is the case of an asham shenisari b'shlomim. Amru lo, the Chacham said, ein mevim kachim lebeis hapsul. How can you do such a thing? You are now bringing a korban and base up sul because you're going to have to eat it on that day, Yom and Laila, as an asham. Yedin hachamer shebahem, Yom v'Laila, right? The day and then the following night, and the following morning, any kodshim that's left over, you're going to have to burn it, even though it might be a shlomim, and if it's shlomim, it gets a full another day. V'rabbanon, according to Shittas Chacham, that don't allow you to be b'maytas man kodshim. Hechi avdina, what are you going to do in the case of a Pesach that gets mixed up with bechoros? In the case of Asham that got mixed up with Shlomim, or Pesach that got mixed up with an Ola or an Asham, then you could say Yira Achi Stov, and then when it becomes a Balmum, you'll sell it and you'll buy Karbonos with the money that comes in. But in the case of Bechar, you can't say such a thing, because with regard to Bechar, the Torah says Lo Tifdeh. There is no pigeon, even after it becomes a Balmum. So that the damim, the monies that you get if you sell it, are not kedoshim. So the behemo is not yotzeis mikedushasa through this pigeon. And the din is that if nofel b'mum nechal lekohen, so this whole possibility becomes excluded. Amar Rava namtin lo achi mumu. We'll wait until it becomes a balmum. The yavi behema shmeini should take a very expensive animal, which is the most expensive of any of the animals, of any single animal that got mixed up. And he'll do a chilul of the Korban Pesach onto the most in the value of the most expensive of all these three animals. V'leiman will declare, Kol heicha di isa lePesach, tochel alei dahai. Anywhere where the Pesach is found, I don't know where it is, there should be a kedusha on these modes. And he should take these modes and purchase this behemoth, and he'll bring it as a korban shlamim, like a din of Pesach, li'achar zman hakrova, v'yachal, and then he can eat the korban Pesach. That was Nisarev and Nofel ben Mum, b'toras bechor bal mum, because the din of bechor bal mum is that you don't do a shvit or sell it on the market. It's not sold by weight like you would normally sell basar chulin. Anyway, with this takana, the bechar in the tarovas would be eaten kidino, kibchar balmum, and the Pesach will be subject to the dia, and will bring it as a korban shlamim kidino.